The day my husband asked for a divorce started like any other morning in our penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Quiet, cold, and strangely polite. The Carter penthouse sat on the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the living space, giving a perfect view of the lake and the slow morning traffic below. Most people would have called it beautiful. To me, it always felt like living inside a display case. I was sitting at the marble kitchen island pouring orange juice for our son, Evan, when Daniel finally walked in. He was already dressed for work. Dark navy suit, silver watch, phone pressed to his ear. He didn't even look at me. "Yes, push the Singapore call to 11, he said into the phone while walking straight past me. "No, I don't care what the board wants. Tell them we'll finalize the acquisition this quarter." Typical Daniel Carter. CEO before husband. Executive before father. I placed Evan's plate of pancakes in front of him and kissed the top of his head. Daniel finally sat down across from me, still talking into his headset. Then he slid a thin leather folder across the counter toward me. He didn't say anything at first, just pushed it forward with one finger while continuing his call. I stared at the folder. White paper. Legal stamp. My name typed neatly across the top. Laura Bennett Carter. Something inside my chest went quiet. Daniel ended the call with a short, irritated sigh and finally looked up. "Sign it." That was all he said. No explanation. No apology. Just 2 words. "Sign it." I slowly opened the folder. Divorce papers. The words sat there on the page, as if they had always belonged in my life. 5 years of marriage reduced to a stack of legal paragraphs. I looked up at him. "You're divorcing me over breakfast?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, completely calm. "It's better this way." "For who?" I asked quietly. "For everyone." That answer told me everything I needed to know. There was someone else. There had been for a long time. Grace Parker, the Carter family's favorite family friend. The woman who somehow appeared at every holiday, every business dinner, every charity gala. The woman Daniel laughed with more than his own wife. But Daniel wasn't looking at me anymore. His phone vibrated again. Another call. He answered immediately. Daniel Carter. While he spoke, he pushed a pen toward me across the marble counter, like a waiter handing someone a receipt. I flipped through the papers slowly. The terms were long, detailed. Too detailed for something prepared overnight. This had been planned. For months. Maybe longer. My eyes moved across paragraphs about custody, assets, property. Daniel kept talking into his phone. Numbers. Contracts. Deadlines. He didn't notice I hadn't signed yet. I closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. "You didn't sign either." He rolled his eyes slightly, clearly irritated by the delay. "Laura, I have 3 calls in the next hour." He grabbed the pen and opened the last page without reading a single line. Then he signed. Quick. Automatic. Like he was approving a business contract. His signature stretched confidently across the paper. Daniel Carter. Done. He slid the folder back toward me. "Now you." I looked at him for a long moment. At the man I had married. At the man who never really saw me. Then I picked up the pen. And signed too. Quietly. Carefully. When I finished, Daniel closed the folder and stood up immediately. No hesitation. No second thoughts. "Good," he said, already checking his phone again. "My lawyer will finalize everything this week." Evan looked up from his pancakes. "Dad, are you leaving already?" Daniel ruffled his hair absent-mindedly. "Big day at the office, buddy." Then he walked toward the elevator without another word to me. No goodbye. No look back. Just the soft sound of the elevator doors closing. The penthouse became silent. Evan kept eating his pancakes like nothing had happened. I sat there for a moment. Then I slowly picked up my coffee. And smiled. Because Daniel Carter had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had signed the papers without reading them. And in doing so, he had unknowingly agreed to a divorce where I walked away with nothing. Not the penthouse. Not the company shares. Not the cars. Not the bank accounts. Everything was transferred to one person. Our son, Evan Carter. Every asset, every account, every investment, all placed in a protected trust, controlled by his legal guardian. Me. Daniel thought he had just erased me from his life. What he had actually done was give me control of everything that mattered. The day my husband asked for a divorce started like any other morning in our penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. Quiet, cold, and strangely polite. The Carter penthouse sat on the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the living space, giving a perfect view of the lake and the slow morning traffic below. Most people would have called it beautiful. To me, it always felt like living inside a display case. I was sitting at the marble kitchen island pouring orange juice for our son, Evan, when Daniel finally walked in. He was already dressed for work. Dark navy suit, silver watch, phone pressed to his ear. He didn't even look at me. Yes, push the Singapore call to 11, he said into the phone while walking straight past me. No, I don't care what the board wants. Tell them we'll finalize the acquisition this quarter. Typical Daniel Carter. CEO before husband. Executive before father. I placed Evan's plate of pancakes in front of him and kissed the top of his head. Daniel finally sat down across from me, still talking into his headset. Then he slid a thin leather folder across the counter toward me. He didn't say anything at first, just pushed it forward with one finger while continuing his call. I stared at the folder. White paper. Legal stamp. My name typed neatly across the top. Laura Bennett Carter. Something inside my chest went quiet. Daniel ended the call with a short, irritated sigh and finally looked up. Sign it. That was all he said. No explanation. No apology. Just 2 words. Sign it. I slowly opened the folder. Divorce papers. The words sat there on the page, as if they had always belonged in my life. 5 years of marriage reduced to a stack of legal paragraphs. I looked up at him. You're divorcing me over breakfast? Daniel leaned back in his chair, completely calm. It's better this way. For who? I asked quietly. For everyone. That answer told me everything I needed to know. There was someone else. There had been for a long time. Grace Parker, the Carter family's favorite family friend. The woman who somehow appeared at every holiday, every business dinner, every charity gala. The woman Daniel laughed with more than his own wife. But Daniel wasn't looking at me anymore. His phone vibrated again. Another call. He answered immediately. Daniel Carter. While he spoke, he pushed a pen toward me across the marble counter, like a waiter handing someone a receipt. I flipped through the papers slowly. The terms were long, detailed. Too detailed for something prepared overnight. This had been planned. For months. Maybe longer. My eyes moved across paragraphs about custody, assets, property. Daniel kept talking into his phone. Numbers. Contracts. Deadlines. He didn't notice I hadn't signed yet. I closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. You didn't sign either. He rolled his eyes slightly, clearly irritated by the delay. Laura, I have 3 calls in the next hour. He grabbed the pen and opened the last page without reading a single line. Then he signed. Quick. Automatic. Like he was approving a business contract. His signature stretched confidently across the paper. Daniel Carter. Done. He slid the folder back toward me. Now you. I looked at him for a long moment. At the man I had married. At the man who never really saw me. Then I picked up the pen. And signed too. Quietly. Carefully. When I finished, Daniel closed the folder and stood up immediately. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Good, he said, already checking his phone again. My lawyer will finalize everything this week. Evan looked up from his pancakes. Dad, are you leaving already? Daniel ruffled his hair absent-mindedly. Big day at the office, buddy. Then he walked toward the elevator without another word to me. No goodbye. No look back. Just the soft sound of the elevator doors closing. The penthouse became silent. Evan kept eating his pancakes like nothing had happened. I sat there for a moment. Then I slowly picked up my coffee. And smiled. Because Daniel Carter had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had signed the papers without reading them, and in doing so, he had unknowingly agreed to a divorce where I walked away with nothing. Not the penthouse, not the company shares, not the cars, not the bank accounts. Everything was transferred to one person. Our son, Evan Carter. Every asset, every account, every investment, all placed in a protected trust, controlled by his legal guardian. Me. Daniel thought he had just erased me from his life. What he had actually done was give me control of everything that mattered. My birthday fell 3 weeks after the morning Daniel handed me the divorce papers. 3 weeks of silence. We still lived in the same penthouse. Daniel still left before sunrise, still returned late at night, still spoke to me only when necessary. But now there was something different between us. Finality. The divorce documents had already been sent to his lawyers. He assumed everything was moving forward exactly the way he wanted. I didn't correct that assumption. Invisible women rarely interrupt a man's confidence. That afternoon, Evan ran into the kitchen while I was packing his school lunch for the next day. Mom. Dad said we're going somewhere fancy tonight. I looked up from the counter. Did he? Yeah, a huge restaurant downtown. He said it's a surprise. Evan was practically bouncing with excitement. Is it for your birthday? I smiled at him. I think it might be. For a brief moment, something warm moved through my chest. Maybe Daniel had decided to end things politely. Maybe he wanted one final dinner. A quiet goodbye. Even broken marriages sometimes deserve dignity. So that evening I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I dressed up. A black silk dress I hadn't worn since our anniversary 2 years earlier. Simple earrings. Soft makeup. When I walked into the living room, Evan stared at me. Mom, you look like a movie star. I laughed softly. That's a little dramatic. Daniel appeared from the hallway, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. For a moment he paused. He looked at me. Not the quick, distracted glance he usually gave. A real look. Then his expression returned to normal. We're going to be late. Of course. The restaurant was one of the most expensive places in Chicago. A private rooftop dining room overlooking the river. When we arrived, something felt strange immediately. The entire entrance was decorated. Flowers. Soft lights. Champagne glasses arranged on silver trays. I frowned slightly. Daniel, did you rent the entire restaurant? He didn't answer. Instead, Evan suddenly gasped. Look. The doors to the private dining hall opened. Inside were at least 30 people. Friends. Business partners. Members of the Carter family. Everyone turned toward us at the same moment. And then someone shouted, "Surprise!" But no one was looking at me. They were looking past me, toward the woman standing at the center of the room. Grace Parker. She wore a white designer dress and held a glass of champagne while people applauded around her. My footsteps stopped. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. Grace walked toward us with that warm, radiant smile everyone loved. Oh, good, you're here. She hugged Daniel first. Then she turned to Evan. Happy birthday to me, she laughed. Evan ran straight to her. Grace, this is amazing. He wrapped his arms around her waist. Daniel placed a hand on Grace's back like it was the most natural gesture in the world. I finally understood. This wasn't my birthday dinner. This was Grace's. Daniel had rented the entire restaurant for her celebration. Grace looked at me then, her smile polite. Oh, Laura, I'm so glad you came. Came. Like I had been invited. Like this wasn't supposed to be my night. The room buzzed with conversation. Music started playing. Waiters moved between guests carrying champagne. And I stood there in the black dress. I thought my husband might notice. Evan pulled Grace toward the giant cake in the center of the room. 30 candles. Pink frosting. Make a wish, someone shouted. Grace laughed and closed her eyes. Evan clapped his hands excitedly. Grace, I know your wish. Oh, she teased. I wish you could live with us. The room filled with laughter. Evan looked at Daniel. Dad, wouldn't that be awesome? Daniel chuckled. That would certainly make things easier. Evan turned back to Grace. I wish you were my mom. The words hung in the air. Nobody corrected him. Nobody looked at me. Grace knelt down and hugged him. That's the sweetest thing anyone has ever said to me. And suddenly I realized something. This entire evening had been carefully arranged. The guests, the speeches, the cake, the decorations, even Evan's excitement. Grace Parker wasn't just Daniel's family friend. She was already stepping into my life, into my place, into my home. And everyone in that room knew it. Everyone except the woman whose birthday it actually was. I felt something inside me finally settle. Not anger, not humiliation. Clarity. I picked up my purse quietly. Daniel didn't notice. Grace was blowing out her candles while everyone cheered. Evan stood beside her like a proud little assistant. No one stopped me as I walked toward the exit. No one even saw me leave. But as I stepped outside into the cool Chicago night, I whispered something to myself. Very calmly, very clearly. Happy birthday, Laura. Because that night wasn't the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of my freedom. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft metallic sound. No one from the restaurant followed. No one called my name. The street outside was quiet compared to the laughter I had just left behind. Chicago's night air was cool, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the soft glow of city lights reflecting off the river. For a moment, I simply stood there. 5 years of marriage had just ended in a room where no one even noticed I had left. Strangely, I didn't cry. Humiliation has a way of burning through emotions until only clarity remains. I pulled out my phone and opened the one contact I had been avoiding for months. Megan Walsh, my best friend since college. The only person who had ever looked at my marriage and said the uncomfortable truth. You're disappearing inside that family, Laura. At the time, I told her she was exaggerating. Tonight, I finally understood she hadn't been. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring. Hey, birthday girl. How's the fancy Carter celebration? For a second, I almost laughed. Can I stay with you for a while? There was a pause. Megan knew me well enough to hear the shift in my voice immediately. Laura, what happened? I'll explain when I get there. Another pause. Then her tone became firm. Of course you can stay here. As long as you need. I ended the call and ordered a car. During the ride home, I stared out the window at the city moving past us. The restaurants. The lights. The people living their own complicated lives. 5 years earlier, when I married Daniel Carter, I thought I had entered a powerful world. A secure world. A world where everything would be stable and predictable. Instead, I had slowly become a decoration inside someone else's life. The car stopped in front of the glass tower that held the Carter penthouse. When I walked inside, the doorman greeted me politely. Good evening, Mrs. Carter. I smiled faintly. Good evening, Thomas. The elevator carried me to the top floor. When the doors opened, the penthouse was silent. Daniel and Evan were still at the restaurant. Grace was probably cutting another birthday cake by now. I walked slowly through the apartment, past the massive living room, past the wall of windows, past the dining table where the divorce papers had sat only weeks earlier. It was strange how a place filled with expensive things could still feel empty. I went into the bedroom and pulled a suitcase from the closet. Then I started packing. Not everything. Just what belonged to me. Clothes. A few personal documents. My laptop. Some photographs of Evan when he was younger. I moved calmly. Carefully. No rushing. Every action felt deliberate. When the suitcase was finally closed, I carried it to the living room and looked around one last time. 5 years of my life had happened inside these walls. But none of it had ever really been mine. My phone vibrated. Daniel. Calling. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I pressed one button. Block. The phone rang once more. Different number. Also blocked. If Daniel noticed I had left the restaurant early, he would assume I was upset. Maybe embarrassed. Maybe sulking. He would expect me to calm down overnight. He would expect me to still be here tomorrow. That was the pattern he understood. Quiet wife. Temporary emotions. Predictable return. He had no idea tonight was different. I wheeled my suitcase toward the elevator. The penthouse lights remained on behind me. I didn't turn them off. The elevator doors closed. As I descended the building, something inside my chest felt lighter with every floor. By the time I stepped outside, the city felt different. Not like a cage, like possibility. Megan opened her apartment door 20 minutes later. The moment she saw my suitcase, her expression hardened. "You finally left." I nodded slowly. "Yes." She stepped aside and pulled me into a tight hug. "You should have done this years ago." Maybe she was right, but timing matters. And sometimes the moment you walk away is just as important as the reason. Because Daniel Carter believed tonight had been my humiliation. What he didn't understand was something far more important. Tonight was the moment I stopped belonging to his life. And once a woman truly leaves in her mind, the rest is just paperwork. Had been living at Megan's apartment for 4 days when Margaret Carter finally decided to appear. Not call, not message. Appear. That was always her style. Margaret Carter never asked permission to enter a situation. She arrived as if she already owned it. Megan opened the door and immediately looked over her shoulder toward me. "Laura, you might want to come here." I stepped into the hallway. Margaret stood there in a perfectly tailored gray coat, her silver hair pinned back with the same elegance she had maintained for decades. She looked exactly the same as the day I met her 9 years earlier. Cold, controlled, judging. Her eyes moved slowly over Megan's small apartment. The narrow hallway, the modest furniture, the ordinary life. Her lips tightened slightly. "This is where you've decided to live?" Megan crossed her arms immediately. "And you are?" Margaret didn't even look at her. "I'm here to speak with my daughter-in-law." I stepped forward. "Actually, you're here to speak with Daniel's soon-to-be ex-wife." Margaret's gaze finally landed on me. Sharp. Assessing. Disappointed. "Laura, stop being dramatic." She walked inside without waiting for permission and placed her handbag on the table like she had entered her own property. "You left the penthouse. Daniel tells me you're ignoring his calls." Her voice was calm, but there was irritation under the surface. "You embarrassed him at Grace's birthday dinner." I let out a quiet breath. That wasn't my dinner to embarrass. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "That is not the point." Of course it wasn't. With Margaret Carter, the point was always control. She sat down slowly and looked at me with the same expression she had used since the day we met. The expression of someone examining a product that hadn't met expectations. "Laura," she said carefully, "we invested a great deal of time preparing you for this family." That sentence made Megan turn her head sharply. Preparing her? Margaret ignored her again. "You were 16 when your parents began introducing you to our social circle." I felt Megan's eyes move toward me. Margaret continued calmly. "We helped with your education, your internships, your connections." Her voice carried quiet authority. "Everything in your life was structured so you could eventually become Mrs. Carter." The room became very still. Megan spoke first. "Wait, are you saying they basically trained you to marry Daniel?" Margaret gave a small nod. "As many respectable families do." She looked back at me. "And now you are throwing that opportunity away over childish emotions." I stared at her for several seconds. 16 years old. That was when Margaret first started inviting me to Carter family events. My parents had always called it an honor. A powerful family taking interest in our daughter. Back then I thought it meant they liked me. Now I understood something different. They had been selecting me, shaping me, teaching me how to behave, how to dress, how to speak, how to represent the Carter name. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "You were chosen because you were calm, intelligent, appropriate." Her eyes hardened. "But most importantly, obedient." Megan muttered under her breath. "This woman is unbelievable." Margaret ignored her again. "You leaving Daniel over something as trivial as social embarrassment is unacceptable." I finally spoke. "My marriage ended long before that dinner." Margaret sighed impatiently. "Daniel is a successful man. Successful men have complicated social lives. Grace is part of that world." There it was. The quiet justification. The Carter philosophy. I looked directly at her. For 5 years, I raised Daniel's son while he built his company. For 5 years, I ran his home. For 5 years, I made his life easier. Margaret nodded. Yes. Like that proved her point. Something inside my chest settled. Do you know what that did to me? Margaret frowned slightly. What? It erased me. The words were quiet, but they carried more weight than I expected. For your family, I continued. I wasn't a person. I was a role. The decorative wife. Margaret's expression hardened again. You are being dramatic. No, I said calmly. I'm finally being honest. I stepped closer to the table. You didn't raise me to be part of the Carter family. You raised me to disappear inside it. Margaret stood slowly. Her patience had ended. You are making a mistake, Laura. Maybe. But it was my mistake to make. For the first time in my life, I said quietly, I'm choosing my own future. Margaret picked up her handbag. Daniel will not tolerate this humiliation. I met her eyes one last time. He already signed the papers. For the first time since entering the apartment, Margaret looked slightly uncertain. She didn't yet understand what that meant. But she would. Soon enough. Because the Carter family believed they had spent years preparing me to be the perfect wife. What they didn't realize was that I had also spent years learning exactly how their world worked. 2 weeks after leaving the penthouse, the divorce was finalized. Quietly, efficiently, exactly the way Daniel Carter preferred to handle uncomfortable situations. Behind polished doors. Through lawyers. With as little emotional noise as possible. His legal team moved quickly because Daniel believed the outcome was simple. The documents he had signed that morning over breakfast clearly stated that I would leave the marriage with nothing. No assets. No shares. No claims. A clean exit. His lawyers probably congratulated him for negotiating such favorable terms. None of them noticed the detail hidden deep inside the contract. The trust. Every Carter family asset connected to Daniel's personal holdings had been transferred to Evan. Protected. Untouchable. Controlled by Evan's legal guardian until he turned 18. Me. Daniel had signed it himself. Without reading. Exactly as he signed hundreds of corporate agreements every year. A confidence is a dangerous habit. My lawyer finalized the paperwork on a quiet Tuesday morning. I sat in his office, watching him stamp the final document. Congratulations, he said carefully. You are officially divorced. The words felt strangely calm. Not painful. Not triumphant. Just finished. Thank you, I replied. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was the certified divorce certificate. One thin sheet of paper that legally ended 5 years of my life. I closed the folder and stood. One more thing, he said. I looked back. Your ex-husband will eventually notice the trust structure. I nodded. I assume so. He studied me for a moment. You planned this very carefully. I didn't answer. Because the truth was simple. Invisible women have time to think. 2 days later, I stood inside Chicago O'Hare Airport holding a small carry-on suitcase. My entire life now fit into something I could lift with one hand. Megan hugged me tightly near the security gate. Are you sure about this? Yes. You could stay here. Start over in Chicago. I shook my head. Chicago belongs to the Carters. She sighed. I hate that you're disappearing. I'm not disappearing. I smiled slightly. I'm starting over. She studied my face for a moment. Then she nodded. Call me when you land. I will. Across the airport terminal, a tall, familiar figure suddenly appeared. Daniel Carter. Even from a distance, I could recognize his walk. Confident. Controlled. Purposeful. Apparently someone had finally told him where I was. He spotted me almost immediately and walked quickly toward the gate. Laura. Several people turned to look. I stayed where I was. When he reached me, he looked slightly out of breath, which was unusual. Daniel rarely rushed. What are you doing here? He asked. Leaving. His eyes moved to the suitcase. You're running away? I almost laughed. Running away. From the man who asked for the divorce. I prefer to call it moving on. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, clearly irritated. You blocked my number. Yes. You left the penthouse. Also yes. He stared at me like I had broken some invisible rule. This isn't how these things work, Laura. I tilted my head slightly. You mean divorce?
His jaw tightened.
You're being dramatic again. Maybe, but I didn't feel dramatic. I felt free. I have something for you, I said calmly. From my bag, I took out a small black gift box. Daniel frowned. What is this? A goodbye present. He looked suspicious, but took the box anyway. Inside was the document folder. The certified divorce certificate. He opened it slowly. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel Carter actually looked confused. This was finalized already? Yes. He flipped through the pages. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. What is this trust clause? I smiled gently. Something you signed. His eyes moved quickly across the document. Then again. Then a third time. For the first time since our marriage began, Daniel Carter actually read a contract. His face slowly lost color. You. The airport announcement interrupted him. Final boarding for Flight 241 to Helsinki. I picked up my suitcase. That's my flight. Daniel looked up sharply. Helsinki? Finland. Laura, wait. But I was already walking toward the gate. Behind me, Daniel's voice followed. What did you do? I turned back once. Not angry. Not bitter. Just calm. I didn't do anything, Daniel. I gestured toward the document in his hands. You signed it. Then I handed my boarding pass to the attendant and stepped onto the plane. And just like that, Laura Bennett Carter disappeared from Daniel Carter's life forever. Daniel Carter didn't understand what had just happened at the airport. Not immediately. For most of his life, Daniel had operated under one simple assumption. Every situation could be managed if you applied enough pressure. Employees could be replaced. Competitors could be acquired. Problems could be negotiated. People eventually complied. Laura had always complied, which was why, standing in the airport terminal holding the divorce certificate, Daniel still believed this situation would resolve itself. He expected me to calm down. He expected me to come back. He expected the emotional storm to pass. But something about the document in his hands made him uneasy. The trust clause. He had read it 3 times before leaving the airport, then a 4th time in the car on the way back downtown. By the time he reached the penthouse, irritation had begun turning into something else. Confusion. Daniel walked into the silent apartment and tossed his jacket onto the couch. The place felt strangely empty. Not physically empty. Everything was still there. The artwork, the furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. But something subtle had changed. A presence was gone. Daniel loosened his tie and walked into the kitchen. For years, this was where Laura stood every morning making breakfast for Evan. He paused for a moment, staring at the marble island. Then he pulled out his phone and called his lawyer. Robert, I need you to explain something in this divorce agreement. His lawyer sounded confident. Of course, Daniel. The terms are exactly what we discussed. Mrs. Carter relinquished all financial claims. Daniel flipped to the page again. Then why is every asset connected to my personal holdings listed under a trust? There was silence on the other end. Robert cleared his throat. That's unusual wording. Daniel's irritation sharpened. Unusual how? I'll need to review the documents again. You already reviewed them. Yes, but... Daniel cut him off. Just tell me what it means. More silence. Then Robert spoke slowly. It appears the assets were transferred to a custodial trust. Daniel frowned. For who? Robert hesitated. For your son. Daniel blinked. Evan. Yes. Daniel walked slowly to the window overlooking the lake. Explain. The trust places the assets under Evan Carter's ownership. Daniel's voice hardened. And who controls the trust? Another pause. Then the lawyer answered carefully. Evan's legal guardian. Daniel already knew the answer. Still, he asked. And who is that? Robert cleared his throat again. Laura. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Daniel turned back toward the kitchen table where the divorce certificate lay. That can't be correct. It is. Daniel's jaw tightened. I signed this agreement. Yes. And my lawyers approved it. Yes. Then how did this happen? Robert spoke cautiously now. Daniel, the clause is legally valid. You authorized the trust structure with your signature. Daniel stared at the papers. The same signature he had written so casually at breakfast. The same signature he used to approve million-dollar acquisitions without hesitation. Confidence. Efficiency.
Speed.
All the traits that made him successful in business. And the exact traits Laura had used against him. Robert, Daniel said slowly, are you telling me my ex-wife now controls every Carter asset connected to my personal accounts? The lawyer sighed. Technically, she controls them on behalf of your son. Daniel felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. Loss of control. For the first time since the airport, Daniel began to realize the scale of what had happened. Laura hadn't argued. She hadn't fought. She hadn't demanded anything. She had simply waited, watched,
Prepared.
and then left. Daniel looked around the penthouse again. The silence suddenly felt heavier. He walked down the hallway toward Evan's room. The door was open. The bed was empty. Evan was spending the week with Margaret. Daniel stood there for a moment. Then he noticed something strange. The room looked untouched. Laura hadn't taken anything. No furniture. No jewelry. No art. Not even money. Daniel walked back to the living room and looked again at the divorce certificate. She had left everything behind. Except control. And herself. Daniel picked up his phone again and opened his contacts. Laura's name was still there. He pressed call. The automated message answered immediately. The number you are trying to reach is unavailable. Daniel lowered the phone slowly. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, a plane was carrying the woman he had ignored for 5 years across the world. And Daniel Carter was only now beginning to understand something deeply unsettling. The invisible wife he thought he could easily replace had completely vanished from his life. 3 weeks after I left Chicago, Daniel Carter's life began to fall apart in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly, in small, unsettling ways. The first problem was Evan. Children notice absence faster than adults. Evan returned from Margaret's house expecting his mother to be home. Instead, the penthouse was strangely quiet. "Where's Mom?" he asked the first evening. Daniel loosened his tie while checking emails on his phone. "She's traveling." "For how long?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "I'm not sure." Evan frowned. "Did she say goodbye?" Daniel looked up.
No.
The boy stared at him for a moment, clearly confused. "Mom always says goodbye." Daniel didn't have an answer for that either. The following days became increasingly difficult. Laura had handled everything in Evan's life. School schedules, meals, homework, doctor appointments. Daniel suddenly realized he didn't even know the name of Evan's homeroom teacher. Margaret tried to help, but Margaret Carter believed discipline solved most problems. Evan didn't respond well to discipline. He responded to patience, something neither Margaret nor Daniel possessed. Grace Parker, however, saw an opportunity. She began appearing at the penthouse more frequently, bringing groceries, cooking dinner, helping Evan with homework, playing games with him. Daniel watched it happen with a strange mixture of relief and unease. Grace had always been good with people. That was part of her charm. One evening she sat beside Daniel on the couch while Evan played video games nearby. "You're doing your best," she said softly. Daniel sighed. "I'm not built for this." Grace placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You're under a lot of pressure." Daniel leaned back, exhausted. Between the trust complication, his company negotiations, and Evan's sudden emotional distance, his normally structured life felt chaotic. Grace looked toward Evan. "He misses his mother." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "I know." Grace hesitated. "Maybe what he needs right now is stability." Daniel looked at her. "What do you mean?" She smiled gently. "A woman in the house." The implication was obvious. Grace had been moving toward this moment for years. But Daniel wasn't thinking about romance. He was thinking about control. about the strange contract Laura had left behind, about the fact that legally, Laura now controlled every asset connected to Evan's inheritance. And Laura was gone. Then something unexpected happened. One Thursday afternoon, the school called. Evan was missing. Daniel's assistant transferred the call to his office immediately. "Mr. Carter, we can't find Evan." Daniel stood up, so quickly his chair rolled backward. "What do you mean you can't find him?" "He left the playground during recess. We thought he went inside the building, but—" Daniel was already grabbing his coat. "I'm coming there now." The next hour was chaos. Teachers searching the school grounds. Security reviewing cameras. Daniel calling Margaret in a panic. For the first time in years, the confident executive looked completely shaken. Then Grace arrived at the school. 20 minutes later, she found Evan. He was sitting on a bench 2 blocks away near a small park. Grace walked him back to the school while teachers and staff rushed forward in relief. Daniel dropped to one knee when he saw his son. "Evan, what were you thinking?" The boy looked confused. "I was waiting." "For what?" Evan pointed toward Grace. "For her." Grace looked surprised. "Me?" Evan nodded. "You told me to meet you at the park." The air suddenly became still. Grace laughed nervously. "Oh, sweetheart, you must have misunderstood." Daniel frowned slightly. But the moment passed quickly. Everyone was too relieved that Evan was safe. The story spread quickly among their social circle. Grace Parker had rescued Evan Carter. Margaret called her a hero. Several of Daniel's business partners even sent flowers. But 2 days later, Daniel's security team delivered something unexpected. A video clip from the park surveillance cameras. Daniel watched the footage 3 times. Grace Parker, standing next to Evan earlier that afternoon, speaking to him, pointing toward the bench, then walking away, leaving him there. Daniel's stomach dropped. It wasn't the misunderstanding. It was staged. Grace had arranged the entire situation. The missing child, the dramatic rescue, the perfect moment to prove she belonged in Daniel's life. Daniel sat in his office, staring at the screen. For years he believed he understood the people around him.
Laura. Grace.
His family. Now, he wasn't so sure about any of them. But one thing became very clear. Grace Parker wasn't the kind, loyal friend she pretended to be. She was something else entirely. And Daniel Carter was no longer in the mood to be manipulated. When the plane landed in Helsinki, the sky was pale gray and the air felt colder than anything I had experienced in Chicago. I stepped outside the airport with a single suitcase and a name that no longer belonged to me. Laura Bennett Carter had disappeared somewhere over the Atlantic. The woman standing in Finland was someone else. Laura Brooks. It wasn't a fake identity. It was simply my middle name, one I had never used before. But sometimes the smallest change is enough to create distance from a life that no longer fits. The first weeks were quiet, almost painfully quiet. Finland in late autumn moves at a different rhythm than Chicago. The streets are calm. People speak softly. No one cares about your last name, your family connections, or the company your husband runs. For the first time in years, I existed without the Carter name attached to me. No expectations. No appearances. No polite dinners where I was expected to smile while other people decided my role in the room. I rented a small apartment in Helsinki near the harbor. Nothing luxurious. White walls. Simple furniture. A desk near the window where ships slowly moved across the cold Baltic water. The silence felt strange at first. Then it started to feel peaceful. I enrolled in language courses within the first month.
Finnish.
Swedish. And advanced Russian. Languages had always fascinated me when I was younger, long before the Carter family began shaping my life around social appearances and corporate events. I studied every morning. 3 hours. Sometimes 4. My teachers quickly realized I had a natural ear for pronunciation and structure. "You learn very fast," one instructor told me. I smiled. When you spend years being invisible in a room, you learn to listen carefully. That skill turned out to be useful. Within a year, I was working part-time assisting a translation office that handled international trade delegations visiting Helsinki. Mostly small assignments at first. documents, meeting summaries, business correspondence. But diplomacy requires precision. And I was very good at precision. One day, a senior translator approached me after a meeting. "You used to work in corporate environments, didn't you?" I nodded.
For a while.
"That explains it," he said. "You understand how executives talk. Corporate language has its own rhythm. Subtle threats, hidden intentions, carefully structured promises. After 5 years married to a CEO, I could recognize those patterns instantly. That skill quickly made me valuable. By the end of my second year in Finland, I was no longer assisting translators. I was becoming one. Officially. International trade delegations frequently needed interpreters who understood both language and business culture. Finnish ministers, European trade representatives, Asian investment groups. I began traveling occasionally with diplomatic teams. Quiet meetings, negotiations, careful conversations between countries where every word mattered. And every time someone introduced me, they used the same name, Laura Brooks. No one in those rooms knew anything about the Carter family. No one knew about the Chicago penthouse. No one knew about the divorce that had quietly dismantled my old life. They simply saw a professional translator who spoke multiple languages and remained calm under pressure. For the first time in my adult life, people valued me for my abilities instead of my marriage. One winter evening, after a long trade meeting with a Norwegian delegation, I walked along the Helsinki harbor as snow fell softly across the city. The water was dark, the air cold, but my mind felt clear. 5 years earlier, I had lived inside a beautiful glass penthouse that felt like a cage. Now I lived in a small apartment thousands of miles away, and I had never felt more free. Sometimes I wondered how Daniel was handling everything. Not because I missed him, but because curiosity is difficult to erase completely. Did he understand the trust agreement yet? Did he finally realize what he had signed? Did he ever think about the woman he barely noticed for 5 years? Maybe. Maybe not. But those questions no longer controlled my life. Because the truth was simple. Laura Bennett Carter had been the perfect invisible wife. Laura Brooks was something entirely different. And for the first time in years, I was finally becoming myself. It had been almost 7 years since I left Chicago when Daniel Carter finally found me. By that point, my life looked nothing like the one I had once lived. Helsinki had become home. The quiet harbor, the slow winter mornings, the rhythm of diplomatic work that required calm minds instead of loud personalities. Laura Brooks had built a reputation in international trade circles as someone precise, discreet, and reliable. No one asked unnecessary questions. In diplomacy, privacy is respected, which is why the moment I saw Daniel standing across the lobby of the Helsinki Trade Center, I knew something unusual had happened. I had just finished translating a meeting between Finnish trade officials and an American manufacturing delegation. The participants were gathering their documents and shaking hands. I turned toward the exit, and there he was. Daniel looked older, not dramatically, but noticeably. The confident posture was still there, but something in his face had softened. Years earlier, his expression always carried certainty. Now there was hesitation. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across the room. Then he walked toward me. "Laura." He said my name carefully, like he wasn't sure he had the right to say it anymore. I closed my folder slowly. "It's Laura Brooks now." He nodded slightly. "I know." There was an awkward silence between us. 7 years of separate lives standing in one quiet room. "You look different," he said. "I am." That was the truth. Not just older.
Not just changed by time. Different.
Stronger. More certain of who I was. Daniel looked around the building lobby. "I didn't believe it when I first heard your name here. You have sources in international trade now." A faint smile crossed his face. "Corporate acquisitions take me to a lot of places." Of course they did. Daniel Carter was still a powerful businessman. Some things never change. Then another voice spoke behind him. "Mom." My heart paused for a moment. I turned. Evan stood there. He was no longer the little boy who loved dinosaurs and pancakes. He was nearly grown.
Tall.
serious, and suddenly very nervous. "Hi, Evan." He walked toward me slowly. For a moment, it looked like he wasn't sure what to do. Then he hugged me. Not the quick, distracted hugs children sometimes give. A real hug. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. The words surprised me. "For what?"
For that night, he said.
Grace's birthday. Memories flashed through my mind. The restaurant.
The cake.
The wish. "I wish you were my mom." Evan stepped back slightly. I was a kid. I didn't understand what was happening. "You were 8, I said gently. "You weren't supposed to understand." Daniel watched the exchange silently. Then he spoke. "Grace is gone." I raised an eyebrow slightly. "That sounds like a story." Daniel exhaled. "When the truth about the park incident came out, it destroyed her reputation." Apparently, after discovering the surveillance footage, Daniel had publicly exposed Grace's manipulation. The Carter social circle turned on her quickly. People who once admired her suddenly wanted distance. Grace moved to another city, eventually another country. Her connection to the Carter family disappeared almost overnight. Daniel looked down at the floor for a moment. I should have noticed sooner. Maybe. But that part of the story didn't matter anymore. Daniel looked back at me. "Laura, I know I don't deserve to ask this. Here it comes. But would you consider coming back?" The words hung quietly in the air. "Evan would like that too," he added. Evan didn't speak, but the hope in his expression was obvious. For a moment I imagined it, returning to Chicago, walking back into the penthouse, reclaiming the life that once belonged to Laura Bennett Carter. But the thought felt distant, like remembering someone else's story. I looked at Daniel. "You finally noticed me." He nodded slowly. "Too late." "Yes." I wasn't angry when I said it, just honest. 7 years earlier, I had left a life where my existence depended on someone else's attention. Now my life belonged entirely to me. "I hope you build something better," I told him. "For Evan." Daniel swallowed slightly. Then he nodded. "I understand." We stood there for another quiet moment. Then I reached out and hugged Evan one more time. "Take care of yourself." "I will." "And call sometimes." "I promise." When I turned to leave, Daniel didn't try to stop me. This time he understood something important. Some people don't leave because they are angry. They leave because they finally realize they deserve a different life. As I stepped outside into the cold Helsinki air, snow was beginning to fall across the harbor again. Behind me, Daniel Carter stood with the son we shared. In front of me was the life I had built from nothing. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely certain about one thing. I hadn't destroyed my old life. I had simply walked away from it. And in doing so, I finally found my own.